Everyone in that quiet suburban neighborhood thought they knew who the criminals were, and who the troublemakers looked like. So when 15-year-old Malik Thompson was seen unlocking a brand new mountain bike outside his school, it didn't take long for someone to call the cops. Moments later, he was face down on the pavement, handcuffed, and humiliated in front of his classmates, all because he fit the description. But what no one expected was that a small, blurry piece of surveillance footage from a gas station across the street would unravel a painful truth, not just about that day, but about the people this town blindly trusted for justice. And when that video played in court, the silence in the room was louder than any siren that had brought Malik down. Malik Thompson had always been the kind of kid who avoided trouble. At 15, he was more focused on making his mother proud than anything else. His bedroom walls were covered in honor roll certificates and drawings of the custom bikes he dreamed of building one day. He didn't have many luxuries, but what he did have, he took care of, especially the matte black mountain bike his mom bought him after saving tips from extra night shifts at the hospital. That Thursday afternoon, school had just let out, and the usual stream of students flooded the sidewalk. Malik walked out of the main entrance with his backpack slung over one shoulder and earbuds in, humming along to a beat only he could hear. He reached the bike rack, bent down, and punched in the 4-digit code to his lock. His bike was exactly where he'd left it that morning. He didn't notice the woman sitting in the SUV across the street. Her eyes had been following him ever since the dismissal bell rang. She watched as Malik glanced around before unlocking the bike, a movement she interpreted as suspicious. Within seconds, she was on her phone with 911, breathless and certain. She told the dispatcher that a young black male was stealing a bike and looked like he might run. She emphasized how nervous he seemed. She never left her vehicle. She never asked any questions. She just assumed. By the time Malik was swinging his leg over the bike, a police cruiser had turned the corner. 2 officers exited quickly, one of them already unfastening the strap to his taser. They didn't call out a name. They didn't ask what he was doing. Instead, one barked for him to get off the bike. Startled, Malik dropped the handlebars and raised his hands. Before he could explain, he was told to get on the ground. He hesitated, unsure of what he'd done wrong. That moment of confusion was taken as defiance. The second officer grabbed his wrist and forced him down, pressing his knee against Malik's back as the cuffs clicked into place. The concrete scraped his chin as he tried to turn his head, desperate to be heard. He kept repeating the same words, "This is my bike." Across the courtyard, other students had pulled out their phones. A few recorded. Some gasped. A teacher standing near the entrance moved toward the scene but stopped herself before interfering. Within minutes, the entire arrest had been reduced to a flurry of viral moments, none of which showed Malik arriving at school hours earlier, riding that exact same bike. As the officers pulled him to his feet, Malik pleaded with them to check the combination lock still dangling from the bike's frame. He offered to give them the code, to show them the registration he had saved in his backpack. They weren't interested. They told him someone had reported the bike stolen, and that he fit the description. That was all they needed. He was placed in the back of the cruiser as students watched in stunned silence. His backpack was left behind, still resting against the bike rack. His phone was never returned to him that day. At the station, Malik was processed like any other suspect. His shoelaces were removed. He was asked if he had any gang affiliations. When he tried to explain again that the bike was his, one officer told him, "You can talk when your lawyer gets here." But Malik didn't have a lawyer. His mother didn't even know he had been taken yet. Meanwhile, back at the school, word began to spread. Some students were outraged. Others shared the video clips without comment. The school's principal issued a brief statement saying they were aware of the incident involving law enforcement and that they were cooperating with local authorities. Malik's homeroom teacher, who had always praised his quiet determination, said nothing publicly. She just deleted his name from the Student of the Week list. It wasn't until nearly 2 hours later that Malik's mother, Tanisha, received a call. She had just finished a double shift at the hospital and was driving home when her phone buzzed. The officer on the line informed her that her son had been detained for suspected theft. They made it sound routine, as if her son being arrested for allegedly stealing his own property was just another day's business. Tanisha arrived at the station out of breath and shaking. The moment she saw Malik, red marks still on his wrists, she knew something had gone terribly wrong. She demanded to know why her son had been arrested without even a basic investigation. The officers offered vague responses. One of them mentioned that a concerned citizen had called and that Malik had been acting nervously. No one had checked the bike's ownership. No one had run the serial number. When she asked whether her son would be charged, they told her that the case was under review. For now, Malik would remain suspended from school until the situation was cleared up. In less than 3 hours, Malik had gone from a straight-A student riding home from school to a handcuffed suspect with his reputation shattered, all because someone made a call, and the police didn't bother to ask a single question before deciding he was guilty. And in that moment, the weight of every stereotype, every assumption, and every unchecked bias in that town landed squarely on Malik's shoulders, leaving behind scars that no one could see, but that he would carry long after the handcuffs came off. The next morning, Malik sat quietly at the kitchen table, staring into a bowl of cereal that had long gone soggy. His mother moved through the kitchen with a mechanical calm, as if holding back the weight of everything that had happened the day before. She had spent most of the night sending emails, calling the school, the precinct, even a local legal aid office. Each call had ended with the same empty phrases: "We're looking into it, we're sorry for the misunderstanding, thank you for your patience." There was no apology. No one admitted any wrongdoing. Malik had been suspended, pending investigation, though there was no actual complaint against him from the supposed bike owner. There wasn't even a missing bike report. But the school claimed the situation had disrupted the learning environment, and until the matter was officially resolved, he was not to return to campus. The story had already spread across social media. The videos taken by his classmates had been shared dozens of times. In some corners of the internet, he was being defended by strangers who called the incident what it was: racial profiling. But in other comments, people questioned what really happened. Some argued that maybe he had done something to make the cops act that way. Maybe he looked suspicious. Maybe he said something wrong. There was always a maybe, always an excuse when it came to black boys and the way the world chose to see them. Malik's friends messaged him, but even their texts felt distant, awkward. They didn't know what to say. Some were scared. Others were told by their parents to stay out of it. The silence from those he considered close hit almost as hard as the arrest itself. The sense of isolation was immediate and cutting. The school administration released a formal statement on their website, crafted to sound neutral and diplomatic. It mentioned an incident involving a student and local law enforcement, reaffirmed the school's commitment to safety, and thanked the police for their swift response. Malik's name was never mentioned. There was no acknowledgement of his innocence. The same principal who had once praised him at the school assembly now avoided his mother's calls. In the neighborhood, opinions were split. Some neighbors brought over casseroles or whispered apologies, saying they couldn't believe this happened. Others stayed silent, choosing to act as if nothing had occurred. A few even seemed annoyed, more concerned about the attention being drawn to the community than the injustice itself. It was easier for them to pretend that Malik was just another teenager who got caught up in something unfortunate, easier to believe that than to face the ugly truth about why it happened in the first place. Tanisha took time off from work, not because she could afford it, but because she couldn't bear the idea of leaving Malik alone. He barely spoke. He spent most of his time in his room, the same space once filled with dreams and drawings. Now the sketches on the wall felt like relics from another life. He had stopped riding his bike. It sat untouched in the corner of the garage, the same lock still hanging from the frame, as if the truth meant nothing in the face of public suspicion. While Malik and his mother grappled with their new reality, someone else quietly took action. Mr. Carter, the school's only black teacher, had been following the incident closely. He had taught Malik in freshman history and had always been impressed by his quiet insight and thoughtful essays. Mr. Carter had seen the video like everyone else, but unlike the school administration, he didn't see a disruption, he saw an injustice. He began asking questions, checking in with colleagues, reaching out to a few students who had filmed the incident. He made a list of nearby businesses and traffic cameras that might have caught something the police didn't bother to investigate. He knew this wasn't the first time a student had been stereotyped or silenced, it was just the first time it had been caught on camera and too public to ignore. Within days, Mr. Carter visited a gas station just across from the school. He asked the owner if their security cameras had been recording during the time of the incident. The owner hesitated but agreed to let him review the footage. What they found would later become the key to everything: footage that showed Malik arriving that morning, riding the same bike, parking it in the same spot where he was later accused of stealing it. Mr. Carter saved the video and called Malik's mother immediately. Tanisha's hands shook as she watched the clip, a sense of vindication and outrage boiling at once. She had begged the officers to check the facts, and they hadn't bothered. But now, she had proof, undeniable, time-stamped proof. Even with that, the road ahead wasn't clear. The school still hadn't lifted Malik's suspension. The police hadn't issued a statement. The damage to his confidence, his reputation, and his peace of mind couldn't be undone by a single video. But for the first time since that awful day, there was something to fight with. Something they could take to court. Something that might finally make someone listen. The footage changed everything, not for everyone, but for those who were finally forced to look. When Tanisha submitted the video to a civil rights attorney, the reaction was swift. What had been dismissed as a routine response was now something else entirely: documented evidence of racial bias and unlawful detainment. The video showed Malik parking his bike that morning, securing it with a lock, and walking calmly into school. It was clear. It was timestamped. And it directly contradicted the basis of the police response. The attorney, Jasmine Reed, had taken on dozens of similar cases over the years, but something about Malik's story cut deeper. He was so young. So obviously innocent. And so thoroughly failed. She filed a formal complaint against the police department and initiated the process for a civil suit against both the officers involved and the school district for wrongful suspension and emotional trauma. News spread quickly. Local journalists picked up the story, and what had once been a quiet injustice was now public. The video clip ran on evening news segments, side by side with the cell phone footage of the arrest. The contrast was stark: a respectful teenager being slammed to the ground by men who never asked him a single question. The public outcry grew louder. Petitions circulated. Community groups demanded accountability. The police department released a carefully worded statement claiming procedures were followed, but that an internal review would be conducted. No apology. No suspension. No accountability. The school district tried to distance itself, claiming it had acted based on information provided by law enforcement. But pressure was building. Parents began to speak out at school board meetings. Teachers started whispering about inequities that had gone unchecked for years. And students, many of whom had remained silent, began to realize they had witnessed something larger than a misunderstanding. They had witnessed a system failing one of their own. When the case finally reached the courtroom, it became more than just a legal proceeding. It became a public reckoning. Civil rights advocates filled the benches. Reporters scribbled notes as Malik and his mother sat quietly, surrounded by people who now saw them clearly. The officers involved maintained they had acted on credible information from a 911 call. They insisted Malik had matched a vague description and had behaved evasive at the scene. Their body camera footage was introduced as evidence, but it only highlighted what the public already knew. There was no effort to ask questions, no investigation, just force. Jasmine Reed focused her argument not only on the physical harm inflicted, but on the psychological damage. She spoke of the humiliation Malik endured, the public suspicion he faced, the nights he spent unable to sleep because he feared stepping outside. She played the surveillance video for the court, pausing on the moment Malik arrived at school. There he was, locking up the bike that he was later accused of stealing, the very image of a responsible young man. Then came the testimony. Malik was asked to describe the arrest. He spoke softly, but every word landed with weight. He explained how he had tried to tell them it was his bike. How he had memorized the lock code. How they didn't care. He described being face down on the ground, surrounded by classmates, feeling the world turn against him for no reason other than what he looked like. When asked how it affected him, he didn't talk about fear. He talked about shame, the shame of being treated like a criminal when all he had done was ride home from school. Tanisha's testimony followed. She described the helplessness of watching her child, who had never been in trouble, be transformed into a suspect by a system too blind to see the truth. Her voice cracked when she said she had taught Malik to respect the law, only to watch the law turn against him without cause. The judge listened, stone-faced. The courtroom was quiet. No one dared to look away. In the end, the video proved what no argument could deny. The charges were dropped, and the record sealed. The school, facing a lawsuit and mounting community pressure, reversed Malik's suspension and issued a formal apology, though it arrived too late to repair the trust that had been broken. But Malik's story didn't end there. His case became a symbol. Across the city, forums were held about racial profiling and policing in schools. Young black students began sharing their own experiences, the times they were followed in hallways, accused of cheating, watched more closely than their peers. What happened to Malik was not an isolated case. It was a mirror. The officers never lost their jobs. The woman who made the false report was never charged. The system did what it always did, protected itself. But for once, someone had forced it to look. And Malik, though changed by the ordeal, had not been broken by it. He had stood up in court, told his story, and refused to be erased. In the months that followed the trial, Malik's story continued to ripple through the city like an open wound that refused to be ignored. His name became more than just a headline, it became a question. A question about how easily a young life could be derailed by a single assumption, a single phone call, a single moment of bias wrapped in authority. His experience became part of a growing movement to re-evaluate the role of police in schools and the way disciplinary decisions disproportionately affected black students. Parents began demanding more transparency from school administrators. Town halls that were once sparsely attended filled with community members, many of whom brought their own stories of injustice and silence. Some spoke of sons suspended for speaking out, daughters searched for no reason, entire families made to feel like outsiders in places meant to nurture growth. The outrage was no longer isolated. It had a name, a face, and a voice. Local activists used Malik's case to push for policy change. They proposed legislation that would limit police presence in public schools, redirecting funds toward mental health services, counselors, and cultural competency training. The district, under pressure from a coalition of parents and students, reluctantly agreed to review its policies. An independent equity audit was launched, and for the first time in years, the institution was forced to examine the racial disparities that had been quietly accepted as normal. Though the officers involved in Malik's arrest never faced criminal charges, the civil suit moved forward. Depositions revealed troubling patterns, dozens of complaints that had been dismissed or buried, each bearing eerie similarities. There were transcripts of ignored warnings, reports marked unfounded, without interviews, and training sessions that hadn't been updated in over a decade. The city eventually settled the case out of court, awarding Malik and his family damages that would be used for his future education and counseling. But no dollar amount could erase the humiliation, the fear, or the trauma. Malik, once a quiet student known for his drawings and love of science, became a symbol of resistance he never asked to be. He began attending youth forums and speaking to younger students about their rights. He talked about what it felt like to be seen as a threat in your own skin. He didn't speak with bitterness, but with clarity, a calm, steady insistence that the truth mattered even when it was ignored. At his old school, change came slowly. The principal eventually stepped down, citing health reasons. A new leadership team was brought in, and one of their first actions was to implement bias training for all staff and to revise disciplinary procedures. Metal detectors were removed, replaced with restorative justice programs. Teachers were trained to recognize the ways implicit bias could influence everything from dress code enforcement to classroom behavior ratings. It wasn't a revolution, but it was a start. Some students still whispered about what happened to Malik. Others openly celebrated him, wearing shirts that said, "Believe Black Boys," and organizing a school-wide assembly during Black History Month where Malik was invited to speak. He didn't talk about the police. He talked about dignity, about how dignity isn't something you earn, but something you're born with, and how the fight was about making the world recognize that. For Tanisha, the reckoning was personal. She had watched her son become a national example of something that happened to Black families every day. She had faced cameras and courtrooms, but also grocery store stares and quiet judgment. She had fought for justice not just for Malik, but for every mother who had been forced to watch their child be broken by a system designed to ignore their pain. In time, she joined a local advocacy group working to reform juvenile justice policies. She began mentoring other parents, helping them navigate the same maze of silence and deflection she once faced alone. The reckoning didn't erase the harm, but it brought clarity. It made visible what had long been hidden, the daily decisions, rooted in bias, that added up to real and lasting damage. Malik's case wasn't just about one boy and one bike. It was about a structure that sees Black children as suspects before it sees them as students, that values order more than understanding, that calls the police instead of asking a question. The headlines eventually moved on, as they always do. New stories replaced the old. But in homes, classrooms, courtrooms, and policy meetings, Malik's name was still spoken. His story was cited in articles, studied in law schools, and remembered in community organizing circles. He had become more than just a victim. He had become part of a shift, one small, powerful step toward a world that sees, hears, and believes Black boys for who they truly are. And in that shift, there was hope, not just for Malik, but for every child who dared to ride a bike, dream big, and exist fully in a world still learning how to treat them justly. Malik's story is not just about one wrongful arrest, it's about a system that still struggles to see Black children as children. But it's also a story of strength, of a mother's love, and a community that refused to stay silent. If this moved you, share Malik's story. Speak up. Stand up. Because justice doesn't begin in courtrooms, it begins with truth, and it begins with us. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more real-life stories that matter. Until next time, stay informed, and stay human.